Welcome back to the book club. I just finished reading book 3 of the Dungeon Crawler Carl series, The Dungeon Anarchist's Cookbook by Matt Dinniman, and I wanted to give my review on the book. There's four main areas where I want to discuss for this review. Number one is the plot, number two is characters, number three is pacing, and then number four is a binary: do I want to keep reading, yes or no? And the other three categories, I'm going to give a rating between 1 and 10. So, to start things off, uh, what do I think about the plot? This was by far the weakest part of the book, in my opinion, and I would rate the plot a 6 out of 10. And the main reason for rating it so low or detracting so many points, even though I think overall the book was pretty good, was that the setting was very confusing, which made it so that the plot was also kind of confusing. And there's a note in the beginning of the book, so just to give a little bit more explanation, the book mentions on the back that this takes place in the Iron Tangle, which is like this crazy train system with a bunch of train lines and train colors that go different places with like other lines that go in weird looping patterns and all this stuff. And it sounds kind of confusing because honestly, it is confusing. Matt writes a note at the beginning of the book that says, "Hey, you don't really need to understand this stuff. Just like the characters are talking about it, but it's all good. You can mostly ignore it," which I think is fair. And it's good that he pointed that out because I probably would have tried to do more like working out in my head at what's going on, and I just didn't do that at all. The problem is that when there's pivotal moments in the story happening, like Carl and his team planning to do something crazy, which happens very often in this series, the fact that you have no idea where they actually are or how they're going to get to where they're going makes it really hard to understand why they're doing something or what they're doing exactly. There's all these complicated like train stations that have branching paths and they have to move trains between lines and blah blah blah. And I will commend Matt because it seems like he was understanding in his mind what was going on and like was planning it out in his head, which is really good. So I think that there's probably cohesion there. The problem is that I barely understood it and was just like reading through it and just assuming it wasn't a big deal because I cared more about like the rest of the plot, the action, and the events that were actually happening. So I think that because the setting was so confusing, it really detracted from uh, how the plot played out. I will say though, if we remove the setting confusion part of the plot, the rest of the plot I think was actually really good. I think that Matt has this way of putting all these tools into a toolbox that the characters have in the earlier books and even earlier, in different parts of this book. And then they come into play in these crazy action scenes. And it's really hard to predict what's going to happen because these characters have so many different items and so many different abilities that, like, you barely see most of them. But then every once in a while, you're like, oh, yeah, he has this crazy thing that helps in this exact situation. And I honestly am not sure how Matt keeps track of all of these items and abilities that the characters have, but somehow he does and he plans out how to use them in interesting ways. There are still a bunch of items from earlier books that haven't really come into play yet. And I'm sure that Matt is coming up with ways for Carl to use them in the future books. And he keeps talking about how, oh, I'm saving this item for, floor 6 because I heard of what's going on floor 6, or, oh, I'm saving this for floor 9. So I think that there are some items that we're not going to see for a while and some that are going to come up more often. I'll also add that there was a large focus on Carl like building bombs and stuff in the first two books, and that was less of a thing in this book, and I think that's good. I was kind of bored by the like Carl figuring out goblin and hobgoblin explosives and that kind of thing. I think the focus being more on how to stitch together the items that they have was fairly interesting. And I think the whole idea of I don't really want to talk that much about what it is, but the Dungeon Anarchist's Cookbook is a thing that exists, and I think that that's a really interesting way to add additional depth to the story. Um, Also, one last point about the plot is that it's very clear that this is going somewhere outside of the dungeon eventually, and I'm excited for that because that's what I wanted. I talked about that a little bit in my last review on the first two books, but it really seems like Carl's trying to break the universe in some way, and that trend continues on in this book. Now, moving on to the characters, I would rate this a 9 out of 10. I think this is the strongest part of the book by far, and also is one of the reasons that I'm interested in continuing to read. I think that one of the lit RPG tropes is the characters can be shallow, or they care about loot and leveling up and like being an RPG guy. And I think that's where Dungeon Crawler Carl is a little bit different. The characters actually have their own motivations. They have this like traumatizing past from the real world that got destroyed, and they're trying to figure out what's going on. There's weird bonds with the NPCs who are being used in weird ways. They're not really living things, but they're still like implanted with memories. And Carl has a lot of does a lot of thinking about how fucked up it is that that these characters are just like repeating these fake lives over and over again, and sometimes they become cognizant of that. So there's a lot of interesting things going on with the characters there. There's a lot of these like team building things that happen where people are partying up and betraying each other and all of that stuff, which I think is super interesting. Everyone has their own various motivations, and Carl tries not to trust anybody but needs to trust some people. So I'm interested in how that develops over time as well. There's clearly some villains out there in the universe, and then there's some good guys in the universe. And so it's going to be interesting to see how those things clash going forward. Next, I want to talk about the pacing. For this, I rated a 7.5 out of 10. And the main reason I'm detracting points here is just because there was so much of the book that had to be dedicated to navigating the dungeon layout, which was confusing, as I mentioned in the plot section earlier, that it slowed the book down in some ways. I think that overall the pacing is pretty good. Things just keep happening. There's constant like boss battles and that kind of thing, which are very interesting and very fun. And because they had to navigate this iron tangle, which was just a mess of railroads and stations and blah blah blah, the pacing suffered because of it. He had to describe how Carl got from point A to point B, which just added a couple pages of nonsense every once in a while in between more interesting plot events and more interesting character events. So I think that the pacing just suffered because of that. I'm looking forward to the next book, which the epilogue of this book mentions that it's much more open. I don't really want to spoil anything more than that because I also don't know anything more than that. But it sounds like there's sort of a joke towards the end where the next floor is not going to be as much of a mess as this one. So I'm looking forward to that. I think that that'll probably help keep the pacing how it was in the first two books, where it was a lot more tight because there was no multi-page explanation on how to get to point A to point B with like colors and numbers spewing about. And now, ultimately, do I want to keep reading this series? The answer is still absolutely yes. I already have books 4 through 6 ordered, so I'm locked into reading them just because I already bought them and they're on my bookshelf. But also, like the plot issues in this book weren't so great that I am not still interested in the plot going forward. I think that mostly it was the setting that was my problem with this book, but I loved everything else. I think that the character developments with Carl and his team are very interesting. I'm interested to see like what the greater universe, what happens in the greater universe going forwards. And I think that one of the things that Matt does really well is there's very clever boss fights and battles between characters. And again, using the characters' tool sets, where they have so many items that you kind of forget about some of them and how exactly they work. And all of a sudden they come up in a boss fight and it works, is this really fun puzzle. So I think that as characters continue to get more and more toys, the plot will become, enhanced by those things. I am very interested in if he continues writing about one floor per book, or if we're going to start to see more floors combined. Like the first book had the first two floors in it, and then book 2 was floor 3, and now book 3 was floor 4. Um, there are ultimately 18 floors of the dungeon. It's still not clear whether or not he's going to get to floor 18 or he's going to escape the dungeon or do something crazy. Um, I'm also not sure if Matt has mentioned before how many books he plans to write. So I'm really not sure if we're ever going to see smaller dungeon floors where there's a book that contains multiple floors, or if now we're set in the pace of one floor per book. But that's something that it doesn't really matter either way to me. I'm just kind of interested in how that ends up working out. I'm not sure if Matt's planning on writing like 17 or 18 or 19 books, or if he's planning on writing 10 or 7. So I'm curious to see where that goes as well. But regardless of how the future books are planned regarding how many floors per book and all that stuff, it doesn't really matter that much. I'm interested in the universe. I'm sort of bought in. I'm going to continue reading. So if you guys are Dungeon Crawler Carl fans, it's really a mouthful as well. Let me know in the comments below. Let me know if you guys know how many books there's supposed to be in this series and that's been said somewhere. Let me know as well, because I didn't see that anywhere, but I haven't looked very hard. I'm very curious how many books Matt plans on writing. He seems to be pumping them out pretty fast, which is great. But I don't know if this is like going to be a 50 book saga or if it's going to be shorter than that. But anyways, if you guys have any thoughts, let me know in the comments below, and I'll see you next time.